We're kind of having a massive row with someone who does capitalism better than us.
That's Kerry Brown, Professor of China Studies and one of my colleagues at the Lao China Institute. I'll show you more of that clip in a moment, but the point I think he's really making here is that China is a lot more similar to us Western capitalist liberal democracies than we in the West often like to think. So when we think about China, it's not always helpful to divide the world into us versus them, democracies versus authoritarianism, or capitalist versus communism. If we do that, we're missing an awful lot of what's actually going on. Here's a longer version of that clip.
I guess, one of the kind of things that is striking about the Chinese order or the Chinese sort of worldview now is that it's a really pure form of capitalism. I mean, it's a capitalism that's stripped of labour rights, a capitalism which is kind of largely stripped of social welfare. I mean, this is why it's really difficult to talk about the Chinese role in the global order, because it kind of has selected things that are quite familiar and quite borrowed from European and American partners or countries, but it has made them extreme. It's made them very, very pure. And I mean, if you look at the kind of problems in Xinjiang or in governance generally in China, I mean, if you look at the role of technology and the role of this very pure form of capitalism, it's not that it's dissimilar. It's not its dissimilarity to our system, but its similarity, which is the really tricky thing. I mean, we're kind of having a massive row with someone who does capitalism better than us.
So what's Brown really saying here? First, he's saying that China is really capitalist. In other words, it's part of the global capitalist system along with the rest of us. And second, he's saying that some of the capitalist practices we see in China are similar to what we're doing ourselves, even if they might be taken to further extremes inside China, such as in the case of poor labour rights, for example. That's really what he means when he says they're doing capitalism better than us. And yes, I do think he's being ironic here. Partly. Why is this important? In a recent video, I talked about two ways of talking about China which I think are problematic. Here I'm drawing on the work of the scholars Nicolas Loubert and Ivan Franceschini. Here's a very quick recap. The first of these problematic ways of thinking about China is as if all the things that we think are wrong with China are because of some eternal defective Chinese culture. This is called essentialism. It's a way of talking about China as if it has always been an innately authoritarian and repressive country. In other words, we shouldn't be surprised now if China has a poor standard of labour rights because, well, that's just what Chinese regimes are like. They're fundamentally different from and incompatible with our delightful Western values. The second way is whataboutism. This is really a way of shutting down any criticism of China by saying basically the West is just as bad or the United States is just as bad or perhaps worse. In other words, you talk about poor labour rights in China, but what about the number of young black men killed by the United States police force? Therefore, you have no right to criticise China. I should say here, in response to some of the very interesting comments that were posted underneath the earlier video, which I really appreciated, by the way. I think the point that Loubert and Franceschini are making here when they criticise whataboutism is not that it's not okay to point out hypocrisy and double standards. I think they would agree that that's entirely valid. I think they would say that the conversation descends into whataboutism when this is used to actually dismiss legitimate criticism of what's going on in China and shut down the conversation completely. In both these cases, the question we're left with is how can we get beyond this so that we can have a serious discussion about what's going on in China without falling into the essentialist or the whataboutist traps. What Loubert and Franceschini are advocating is that we don't try to examine China in isolation as if it's cut off from the rest of the world, but instead we recognise that China is embedded in global capitalist structures which have profoundly shaped the way it is and which the rest of us are embedded in as well. And when we ask questions about China, we should always take this as our starting point. This means that if we're critical of what's going on in China, we also recognise the ways that we as Western capitalist democracies are both complicit in the processes which have produced the China we know today, as well as subject to these processes ourselves. Let me give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about regarding the issue of labour rights. There are two common narratives in the West about labour in China. One is that China's labour rights are bad. Many workers in the lower end of the pay scale are paid very little. They're made to work long hours on precarious contracts. Another common narrative is that Chinese workers are stealing our jobs. And this was a prominent narrative which Donald Trump used a lot in his first presidential campaign. The discussion here is framed around China being an essentially repressive and threatening authoritarian regime. And actually, if we want to understand how the world works, that only gets us so far. But if we open up the framing of the question to ask about the broader global capitalist structures which China is operating within, along with the rest of us, we can see a much fuller picture. For example, in their book Global China as Method, Loubert and Franceschini point out that actually, during the 1990s and 2000s, Chinese policymakers went to real efforts to put into practice labour regulations which were in keeping with international standards. What happened was that in the process of formulating and negotiating those regulations, China came under a huge amount of pressure, both from domestic corporations within China and from foreign chambers of commerce, to basically make these regulations worse for Chinese workers. As just one example, they quote the president of the European Union Chamber of Commerce, who said, in a statement in 2006, just as Chinese policymakers were in the process of drafting the labour contract law, the strict regulations of the draft new law will limit employers' flexibility and will finally result in an increase of production costs in China. An increase of production costs will force foreign companies to reconsider new investment or continuing with their activities in China. So why are labour conditions so bad in China? Well, partly because we, nice liberal democracies, pushed them in that direction. And if we are going to talk about Chinese labour practices in China now, then this is something that we need to keep as part of the conversation. A second example, and related to this, is that of Foxconn. This is a very well-known Taiwanese electronics company, which famously has some very large factories in China. Foxconn has been in the news several times for its very poor workers' rights, including, quite horrifically, a spate of worker suicides at their Shenzhen factory in 2010. Again, more recently in 2022, during the COVID lockdowns, workers at their factory in Zhengzhou were subject to a very harsh closed-loop system. Their freedom to move within the facility, or indeed leave the facility, was so restricted that the sociologist Eli Friedman has stated that, based on the evidence, this likely amounted to a situation of forced labour. But again, let's remember that one reason for this particularly harsh situation would have been the pressure that Foxconn was coming under in the months running up to Christmas to produce the Apple products, such as iPhones and laptops, for its overseas consumers. Many of them in Western liberal democracies, of course, including me. Actually, I use a MacBook to make these videos, which may well have been made at that factory. So who is really responsible? And what does this mean for people like me who study China and write about China and teach about China for a living? The point here is not that we're all bad and we should all give up, nor is it to let China off the hook. The point is that if we're going to be critical of what's going on in China, we should, number one, criticize these global capitalist structures as a whole, not just China in isolation. And number two, we should be asking questions about how we ourselves are complicit in these same processes and ask what should we be doing differently. If we're not asking these questions, then criticizing China can start to look like politically motivated China bashing. With rising geopolitical tensions, we're seeing far too much of this already. Okay, so you might be thinking that all of this is really obvious. We all know that China participates in the global capitalist economy. What's the big deal? But the fact is, talking about China in this way and asking these kinds of questions about China is not the norm. It's actually quite unusual. If you want to know what I mean by that, do go back and take a look at this earlier video. Both left and right are getting China wrong, if you haven't seen it already. Thank you for watching.